personal protective equipment to 10,000 schools in our state. Many have already received it. In some cases, it's still on the way. And so those steps have been taken to help us prepare for the reopening. But in recent times, we've seen a high number of cases of COVID infection. And as these rates have increased, they have signaled to us that we must proceed with caution. As we've always said, safety has to be paramount and safety first. As we always said, we won't open a school unless it's safe to do so. If the health and science data that we have suggests that it is able to be done safely. The criteria that the governor and the California Department of Public Health have provided us gives us a very firm set of metrics to think about when schools should be opening. And that all centers around the schools that are in counties that are on the monitoring list. And we know that this gives us a very clear metric. If you've been on that list and if you've not been off of that list for 14 days to not open. But there are some exception opportunities to be able to open in those counties for elementary schools in small groups, small numbers of students. We know that some districts are even planning to open some small numbers of students on their campus for in-class instruction, including students with disabilities. And in some cases, school districts are thinking about a kind of childcare pod or technology pod, that would create the ability while the school district is in distance learning for parents who have to work to have some ability to have their children with caring adults who can help them with that distance learning while they're at school. They might be with a substitute teacher or a classified staff person. And so our conversation really does turn to notions of distance learning. I'm grateful to all Californians who moved into distance learning in March, because we really needed to do that to make safety first. We didn't have a playbook for how to do that. So that means that people moved overnight into distance learning, and sometimes there were bumps. And we know that some of the learning gaps and equity gaps that we were already working to reverse were exacerbated as families moved into distance learning. Many families didn't have access to computing devices. Many families and students did not have access to teachers and counselors and staff. And so as we prepare to move into distance learning again, we take those lessons from the past and we're using them to help us think through how to smooth out those bumps in distance learning. We are working with educators, the State Board of Education, many in the legislature, and educators directly in the organizations that represent educators to really think through what distance learning will need to look like going forward. How do we get the balance right between live instruction, how do we get the balance right and making sure that there's plenty of training opportunities for teachers and educators to utilize distance learning to the fullest potential. Let's face it, distance learning and remote learning for the most part is new for California. That has not been our way, but out of necessity, because of the safety and well-being of our students, we are now finding ourselves needing to really study those best practices and figure out ways to do that. And that's what we're doing at the California Department of Education, looking at those best practices in distance learning and remote learning, looking at the experiences of many of our teachers who leaned in and were using ingenuity on how to really, let the computer relationship between teacher and student not be a barrier, and to create opportunities to try to replicate what would normally happen if students were being with their teachers in person instruction. We know that it's never the same, but we do our best to create the conditions for learning that support our students. And we know that some students have actually benefited during distance learning. Many have not. And we know that we've got to do much more work to support English learners and families that don't have access to computers, families that are struggling for meeting basic needs. And that's where we're making our focus right now. I want to thank all the educational stakeholder groups, teacher groups, classified employee groups, educational administrator groups. Everyone is thinking about how do we create quality distance learning. We don't have a lot of time, but we're going to use the time as well as we can as we move forward to ensure that we create quality in distance learning. One way that we have to really accelerate our efforts is around computing devices. We know there's 700,000 students at least in California who have an immediate need for computing devices. We are working with a number of tech companies that are trying to identify supply so that we can provide computing devices to students. We know that there's at least another 300,000 some students who need access to a hotspot. And so there's an opportunity here for us. The governor and the legislature put in the budget $5.3 billion for distance learning. And those dollars can be used for computer devices and technology, for social emotional learning, for professional development, for our staff. And so what we're working on right now, the California Department of Education is allocating those dollars. We've come up with the figure that each school district will receive. We've informed them of those figures, and we're recommending that they use some portion of it to purchase computing devices. We're literally looking at the overlay between those districts that have let us know that they need more help in getting computing devices and hotspots with the amounts that those districts have received in the distance learning dollars, to say, let's create a match between those dollars and the supply so that we can, as quickly as we can, get computers in the hands of students and families. And so as we move into distance learning, we're thinking about training for educators, we're thinking about devices, we're thinking about family engagement. And we'll be asking our school districts to do all that they can to make themselves more accessible to families that may not have access to email, that may not have access to a lot of technology, that they'll need to be able to call someone to talk about the paper packet that they've received, or if they need additional support, or if they have questions. There's got to be a designated staff person. This is something that we intend to talk with our school district administrators groups and educational leaders about how we build that kind of family engagement that will support our students. I also want to talk to you about our ongoing efforts to address issues of race and racism and bias as we continue to experience what has been a period where we need healing nationwide. In the days and weeks following the killing of George Floyd, we have seen a great amount of pain and anguish as we've seen great deals of police brutality and race and racism has been magnified in ways that we must speak to. Black Lives Matter, and we must do all that we can to address the historical racism that has impacted African Americans dating back to slavery and the impacts that it has had. We must address racism and bias and prejudice in all of its forms. And there's data that shows that there's been an increase in hate against African Americans, against Jewish people, against gays and lesbians. We have to stamp out hate wherever it exists. And in this moment, the Department of Education is leaning in to see how we use educational resources to help promote tolerance and understanding, to address bias. Because let's face it, bias exists in every sector, not just education. And we have to make sure that we continue to address bias in all the places where it exists. And through some resources that we've been able to receive, through grant applications from foundations, we are working to roll out a new initiative that focuses on training for educators in our schools on dealing with implicit bias. We think this is a tremendous opportunity. We've been leaning in to grow and build a youth advisory council at the Department of Education. We started it just as a way of giving support to students. We were doing virtual support circles with students. And as we were doing those support circles, students also shared their great ideas for how we can make social justice and racial justice and make change in this country. One of the things that our students said is they wanted to see more positive representations of themselves in the history that they learn at school. They spoke explicitly about the desire to have more ethnic studies. And so we've just concluded a 4-week series on introduction to ethnic studies that was designed and geared towards supporting young people who wanted to learn about ethnic studies, many of whom were learning and hearing about it for the first time. We created a virtual learning series. Think of it as a classroom experience online where students engage in conversation with instructors who are trained in ethnic studies to talk about the 4 disciplines that most talk about when it relates to ethnic studies. That is providing positive representations of African Americans, of Latinos, of people of Asian Pacific Islander descent, and of Native Californians and Indigenous people. And we've had just an amazing series for the last 4 weeks straight with great people and great guests who've come on to share their expertise and their experiences with us, like Assembly Member Dr. Shirley Weber, who's taught Africana Studies for decades, who's an expert in the field, like Assemblymember Jose Medina, who taught Chicano Latino studies, who, like Assemblymember Weber, they both have legislation that would expand ethnic studies in higher education and in K-12 education. We've had folks come on like the legendary and the iconic Dolores Huerta, who shared her ideas and feelings about why Chicano Latino studies is so important, why ethnic studies is so important. She's been an advocate for expanding ethnic studies in California and in other states. We've had folks like Karen Korematsu, the daughter of the late great civil rights leader Fred Korematsu, who was detained in a Japanese internment camp, who sued the United States on the grounds of civil rights about that detainment. And what has led from that is the legacy of Fred Korematsu is an understanding of the kind of prejudices that have existed in this country against Asian Americans and others. And so we've had a robust conversation about what is American studies, Asian American studies, and how does that connect to ethnic studies. And finally, just recently, we rounded out the series with a conversation about the experience of Native people in California and what is the true history of Native people in California, the great contributions that our tribal community in California has provided. And we've told the story of the oppression and the genocide that Native people in California have experienced. This has really given us a great platform to really lead up to what we intend to do in just a few days, and that is release a new draft for consideration for a model ethnic studies curriculum. And this will be released on Friday of this week. What that draft will do is give consideration of a future template that school districts can use to build their own curricula around ethnic studies. And so we're working to get that draft out, and then it will go to our Instructional Quality Commission that will review it and discuss it and make recommendations in mid-August. And so this is the first step as we move in a process that will culminate with the State Board of Education, likely next year, taking up that draft model ethnic studies curriculum and making some recommendations for its final implementation. And so we stay tuned in the conversation about ethnic studies, but we've had this incredible 4-week mini-series, as we call it, that's helped us to lift up conversations about the importance of ethnic studies, how it can help to provide healing for all of us at this time in our nation, especially our young people. It's my honor to share with you just these few updates about some of the many things that we're working on. We're going to continue to be working around the clock to address all of them. We want to see a great, safe reopening of schools. We want to support our students. We want to provide more counseling. Many of you know I've convened some hearings that allow us to expand our counseling programs. I have a counseling coalition that's looking to figure out how we expand. And we're looking to figure out how to leverage more funding for counseling and mental health programs, restorative justice programs. In the face of an economy that's deeply impacted, we want to make sure that we are doing more. I'm also wanting to just share with you my appreciation for the leadership in the legislature in both houses who've created a proposal to support economic stimulus and recovery for California. We absolutely need our Congress members to get it right and to get a stimulus package for all of our states that helps those who've lost their jobs, that helps those who need support. We've written to the Department of Agriculture to say we want more flexibility in how students get meals at school sites. And so we're advocating there to do all those things. But I'm also excited that our own California leadership and legislature has put forward a package of revenue generating opportunities that will create jobs, that will stimulate our economy, that creates money for schools, including for technology. And I'm grateful for many like Senator Hertzberg and others who've worked on this under the leadership of our Senate Pro Tem President Tony Atkins and our Speaker Anthony in the Assembly, our Speaker Assembly Member Rendon. We're excited to connect and to continue to move this forward. These are just some of the updates I'd like to share with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have for me at this time.
Okay, thank you, Superintendent Thurman. Our first question is from Angelina Wong at KTSF TV in the LA area, and this is related to distance learning. And she asks that her question is, most school districts will open the fall semester in distance learning. Since there will be no kids at school, will teachers return to school to teach and provide the distance learning? I did respond quickly into the chat that I believe this is a local decision that some of our school districts are making to provide some choice, but I will hand this over to you, Superintendent.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for the question, Angelina. And you are correct, Daniel, that the decision about whether or not there will be teachers on campus does vary from district to district. And at the end of the day, our 1,000 school districts, they make their own decisions about how staff is arranged. It is not unlikely that there could be some staff on campus who might be delivering some instruction even while schools are in distance learning. Those decisions ultimately have to be synchronized with county health officials, the county health officer and others who determine that it would be safe to do so. We know that schools have also expressed some interest in being able to maintain, even while in distance learning, some small number of students on campus who might receive in-class instruction, and that this has been a preference expressed by a number of school districts to support students with disabilities. And so right now, most of our school districts are in their final stages of planning about how this might look. Angelina, we'll have more information in the days to come about the number of school districts that may actually have some students and staff on campus, even though they're opening, for the most part, in distance learning.
Thank you. Next question is from Brenda Villa at KNBC in the LA area. And her question is about parents preparing for the new school year. Many parents are concerned for schools to resume this fall, not knowing who their teachers will be or how in-person classes may operate. What's going to happen when schools resume? How can parents, students prepare for this new school year?
Brenda, thank you for the question. I think all of us who are parents of students in our schools are all wondering the same question. What teachers will there be, especially for students who are transitioning into a new school? If they're moving into middle school or into high school, not only are they getting new teachers, but they're moving into a new school environment. A number of us parents are in those same positions, and we're all wondering those questions. Right now, educators across the state are trying to think through all the scenarios that we need to address about how do you engage new students when they're new to the school and they're new to the teacher. Right now, everyone's working on these kinds of scenarios, and the Department of Education is partnering with the State Board of Education, California Teachers Association, California Federation of Teachers, the Association of Administrators, all working together in different conversations to think through how this might all look. And so at the same time, school districts that make their own decisions through their school boards are announcing as they have information, when school will start, what will the opening procedures be, what form will it be in. They're also laying contingencies because there are some places in the state that are in counties that have had lower cases and that they are planning to open. But I think everyone's creating contingencies to be ready for whatever happens when it comes time for school to be open. What I would tell your followers, Brenda, to your viewers and others to really think about is to pay attention to what's happening on the school website. Listen for those all calls. I know that I get calls too, like many of you, from the school districts in my area that are saying, we're putting on a special webinar for families. We're putting on a special workshop so that people can hear what's going to happen in the school year and hear the amount of time that students will be in class and how it will be arranged. Schools are putting out announcements weekly and in some cases daily through their all-call systems to get messages out. And so I would just suggest that for those who are part of the KNBC family, that they reach out to their local school district for the best information about what's going to happen in schools. We'll put out information once we have it, but the best information will be coming from the local school district.
Thank you. See a few questions coming in here, and like I said, we'll get to as many as we can in the time allotted. This one is a two-part question from Heather Jansen at CBS 13 here in Sacramento. First is a follow-up on campus. some districts are requiring teachers return to campus, despite teachers stating they feel unsafe to do so. Do you have a message in response to the teachers who may feel this way? The second part of the question is about the digital divide. Is there an update on the number of families who may still be without technology or internet this upcoming school year?
Thanks for the question, Heather. I think we've offered a consistent message to districts. And let me just say this in the way California law is set up, local bargaining groups, employee groups, bargain work conditions with their school district, things like the calendar and the schedule. And while those continue to be items that are bargained, the message that we've delivered to school district officials has been the same, that work with your bargaining groups, continue to be in conversation with them. Let's do this early. Let's get this resolved before school starts. We want everyone to have clarity about the circumstances. The message that we've also provided to administrators and school leaders has also been take into account that there will be staff and students who may have underlying health conditions. What we know from the science is that those underlying health conditions put those folks at risk. And so our message has been that school districts need to work with their employee groups to find some way to make an accommodation for those who have an underlying health condition. If possible, give them the opportunity to work by remote. In some districts, we've heard the conversation that even those whose positions don't automatically lend themselves to normal remote situations, that they're having conversations together, the district and the employee groups, to figure out what might be alternative arrangements to support real needs. Many of our staff are helping with providing meals. Many of our staff are providing additional functions to support the school. There have been creative arrangements about how schools get sanitized. And so our message continues to be, keep those doors of communication open, keep that dialogue open, recognize that we have to think about the safety of everyone, staff and students, because anyone who has an underlying health condition faces a threat to their own health and well-being, and they pose a threat to others if we aren't sensitive to the accommodations that they might need. Some students might say, I need to have distance learning because of a compromised health system, and that if they get exposed to COVID, that they could be putting their own family at risk. The same is true for our educators. Now is the time for compassion and for communication and working together with flexibility to come up with clear roles for those who need accommodation and flexibility due to an underlying health condition.
Great, thank you. Question from Sonali Kohli at the Los Angeles Times about special education, which you had referenced earlier. How are you thinking about meeting the needs of special education students during distance learning? And what is your expectation of schools during this time in providing special education services?
Thanks for the question, Sonali. As you know, it varies from district to district. Some districts literally are trying to organize opportunities to keep small numbers of students on campus who may have special needs and really need that kind of instruction. And if they can do that in a way where they maintain physical distancing, that will help. Obviously, we'd like for students to be wearing a facial covering because of the science that we know that says that is one of the best ways to help, prevent the spread of coronavirus, in addition to physical distancing and washing hands. We do know that there are some students who have disabilities who cannot tolerate wearing a face covering, or they may need to see the facial expression of their educator. For those reasons, I'm grateful that our partnership with the governor and the Office of Emergency Services has resulted in equipment being provided, like a clear face shield that can be used for those students who may not be able to tolerate a facial covering, or who may need to see their educators, their facial expression. And so that's just one small resource that's been made available that I think will help. At the end of the day, I think what's important is that everyone be thoughtful about making sure that we continue to deliver special education, that we continue to provide services to students with disabilities. It would be a mistake for anyone to say, well, we've never done this in distance learning before, and we're just not going to do anything at all. That goes against everything that we know about the guarantees that students have to receive a free and appropriate education. We've got to continue to support them in those ways. And that means that in many cases, students will receive services directly, or maybe even an IEP over a device. And we know that teachers and staff have done this and have done this with success, that they've found ways to check in. I want to see, how we can get the best ideas from our educators all across the state and the best practices and researchers so we can maximize how we do the best things in delivering special education. Let's face it, it wasn't designed this way, but for safety reasons, this is where we need to be. And we know that, students with disabilities, sometimes are happy just to be on that Zoom because of the connection that they need, and seeing their teacher, and seeing their one-to-one aid. These things are important. We want to make sure we're building in those opportunities for this to happen. We want to make sure we're building in opportunities to utilize best practices. I talk about the 3 pillars all the time that we have to think about, not just in serving students with disabilities, but serving all students. Safety first. The second pillar is we address the social emotional learning needs of our students. The third is we work on the continuity of learning. We want to provide quality to our students. I'm working with a number of great organizations on social emotional learning. There are gaps. There are students who haven't checked in, and we've got to make sure that we identify those students. We put resources in place to help them. I'm grateful for groups like California School Counselors Association, California School Psychologists Association, the Alliance, which is a statewide organization that serves students who are in foster care, that provide school-based mental health. Many of these are the groups who are coming together, the Association of Social Workers. I'm trained as a social worker and proud of that organization, but proud of all of them coming together to say, how can we fill gaps? And we still have a lot of work to do, but we know that addressing those 3 pillars is going to be important. Safety first, social emotional learning needs of our students, and the continuity of learning, which means just let's make sure there's quality in distance learning.
All right, and I think we only have time for about one more question here. This one is from Melissa Adon at KNSD TV in San Diego. Melissa asks, is there a timeline of what's next? For instance, will decisions be staggered throughout the state of when and how staff and students return to campus, or will the final decision come from the state or local level and when?
Melissa, thanks for your question. The decisions are being made as we speak. The decisions actually come out at the local level. Each school district, each of our 1,000 school districts makes their own decisions. At this point, the state has provided guidance that helps to inform those decisions. The Department of Public Health has put out the health metrics to help districts think about how to open. The Department of Education has put out some guidance to think about how to arrange classes, how to arrange instructors and staff in ways that keep everyone safe. But there will be additional guidance that comes out from the Department of Education and the state board as we continue to work on issues related to distance learning and the quality of distance learning. Expect that there'll be updates really on a weekly basis, and that we'll continue to provide webinars that help to provide more education and support for our students and for their educators and for their families. At the Department of Education, we have provided, since the pandemic began, more than 60 webinars that speak to various topics in how we support our students. This includes supporting students with special needs and disabilities. This includes supporting English learners. This includes how to promote engaging topics in education. We're going to continue to lean in on distance learning. We're going to provide additional thoughts and best practices on how to balance live instruction and the non-live instruction, synchronous instruction and asynchronous instruction. We're going to talk about how to balance out the school day, because we agree students need contact with their educators and staff, but there's a balance that students shouldn't be sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day. And so we're going to figure out ways to help inform the field, learn from the field, share best practices. We're going to lean in hard. We're working with a number of great organizations around the state to figure out how to provide more training to educators so that we can enhance distance learning. We're looking at the best research that's available. If there are people out there who are researchers who want to work with us, we welcome you to be a part of the work that we are doing. You can reach out to us at covid19@cde.ca.gov. On the issues of the digital divide, we know that there are still hundreds of thousands of students without computers. Upwards of 700,000 students still need a computing device. 300,000 to 400,000 still looking for hotspots. The Digital Divide Task Force that I created has been able to get guarantees from all of our internet service providers that they will provide, in some cases, free internet, in almost any case for those who qualify, low-cost internet, high-speed internet, where people don't have to provide their social security number or get involved in a whole background check. They just say that we're interested. And if anyone needs help in how that happens, please contact our office. We're also looking for donations of computers still, and anyone who wants to help can help us by going to donate-tech@cde.ca.gov. We are mobilizing and scrambling. We've got to close the digital divide in the near future. We know that it's not going to be possible to help 700,000 students get a device by the time school starts, but we know that we've got to move to get as many as we can. There's supply issues. We're working through them. There are donation needs. Many students just need to have help. And we know that we have to think about the long-term needs to close the digital divide. We have parts in the state that don't have the infrastructure that they need to have access to the internet. And we're working with legislators. We're working with our delegation in Congress to maximize programs that can help to get us ready to build that infrastructure and to help close the digital divide. I'm grateful to everyone who's a part of our task force on closing the digital divide, my co-chair, Senator Leyva. I'm grateful to the members of that task force who have been invaluable. Senator Mike McBride. I'm grateful to the members of the Assembly on that task force, Assembly Member Jim Wood, Assembly Member Autumn Burke, Assembly Member Miguel Santiago, Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia, Assembly Member Cecilia Aguiar Curry, and I'm grateful to all of those who've helped us as we move forward in this work. We have much work to do, but we're going to continue to do it on behalf of our 6 million students. We have lots of questions that we have to get answered. We're going to answer them together because we're stronger together and we'll be safer together. So continue to be safe and well wherever you are. For now, that's it for today. And you stay tuned for more updates from the California Department of Education.